Actually, a few years ago, we produced this issue of the International Review of the Red Cross on Migration and Displacement and decided to launch a cycle of events following this publication to discuss about the challenges, but also the solutions when it comes to this massive humanitarian challenge of our time, displacement, migration. And we had a series of conferences, and tonight this is the final event for this cycle. We had 14 events in Geneva, in different countries, on different continents. We had events in Melbourne, in Moscow, in Ljubljana, in Jakarta, in Wellington, in many places. And we discussed many different challenges faced by the people on the move, such as immigration detention, search and rescue at sea, the principle of non-refoulement, and a series of other complex issues. We did not discuss it only among scholars and experts, but we also brought the voice of the affected people. We had people coming to share their testimonies during these events and meet not only academics, but also people working on border security, governments, donors, NGOs, international organizations, practitioners. And that was a very rich cycle of conferences. So of course, through the cycle, we've seen the complexity of the challenges we face, but we were always looking for solutions. Perhaps the complexity comes not only from the scale of the problems we face, but also from its growing politicization. So the solutions are not purely technical, they're also in the minds of the people and in the discourse. And tonight we will discuss again about solutions, and more specifically we want to discuss tonight how IHL can provide a useful lens to help us address the causes and effects of displacement linked to situations of armed conflicts in particular. Let me say a few words about that. This is the final event of our cycle, but actually it's the first launch of a study as part of a new research project which is called IHL Impact, or Impact of International Humanitarian Law. We developed this new project, and you will hear Cédric Cotter presenting his conclusions. As we have observed in the past few years, and I'm sure you saw that as well, a growing skepticism when it comes to the power of international humanitarian law, or the protective power of the law. Obviously, we see crimes and violations on TV, and this creates a growing frustration. But there is also a toxic discourse which is adopted to dehumanize the enemy, the others, and which, with time, can really perhaps make those violations banal and weaken the power of the law. So in order to counter such a negative and pessimistic discourse, the ICRC wanted to give new perspectives on the promotion of international humanitarian law, demonstrating its relevance in contemporary conflicts. We wanted to take the law also outside of the legal faculties, outside of the books, but go back to its essence and recall its protective power, the simplicity of the norms behind the treaties and the complex legal reasonings. The first initiative we took was about recalling that actually international humanitarian law is respected in many instances. And we started collecting cases of respect to counter a discourse where people say, well, it's always violated, it doesn't work. Well, actually, at the ICRC, we know well that actually international humanitarian law helps us save lives every day. So we wanted to collect those cases of success of the law to balance the discourse. And we've created a database called IHL in Action that you can visit online on icrc.org. But this was not enough. When the law is respected and when it is violated, it has direct consequences. So we wanted to study also the impact IHL can make in real life. It has direct consequences for the life of individuals, for their health, their well-being, but also their future, their possibilities to get education, a job, their trauma, their entire life will be affected by conflicts. But beyond the individuals, it has also an impact on societies. It has an impact on communities. It has an impact on cities. It has an impact on international displacement. So we see all these phenomena and we assume that actually, yes, international humanitarian law can make a difference because it addresses both the challenges on the battlefield, but it may have an impact, sometimes indirect, sometimes direct, sometimes short-term, sometimes long-term, on this phenomenon, such as education, public health, development, or return to peace. This can be affected positively or negatively by the way the parties behave on the battlefield. So we initiated a second project called International Humanitarian Law Impact, and tonight we're presenting the first study of this second project. Combining academic study, drawing on our own experience, being present on all battlefields, or most battlefields for the past century and a half, we have been trying to examine the effects that arise both from IHL compliance and violations. And we want to circulate these findings to give more arguments for those who defend the law today. That's our objective, to improve our humanitarian work through these type of studies. So tonight, we're going to present these first results, discuss them. We're very curious to get your feedbacks on that, because as everything new, it's very interesting also to test these ideas and move the discussion to the next step. So thanks in advance for your questions. And after the event, you will be able to collect the study itself and also access it online. You can download it also on ICRC.org. Thanks for coming. Thanks in advance for your questions. And I give the floor to Helen. Thank you.
Well, this year, as we all know, is the 70th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. And for more than 70 years, ICRC has been raising our voice loudly about the importance of all parties respecting international humanitarian law during times of armed conflict. But I think tonight, as Vincent expressed, we're trying to move into not just using our expertise, which comes from our strong knowledge on IHL, not just using our experience that comes from being on the ground, but also looking at research and what I would say is some facts and evidence behind what we always talk about, sometimes in a very intuitive way. So it's really great that you can be with me tonight. I also wanted to note that it's the 100th anniversary, I think in the last few days, of the International Federation. So it's great to be able to be part of a family of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement that's so old, but at the same time so young and tries new things. Now, today we hear a lot, and it's actually even in our ICRC institutional strategy, about the need to be evidence-based. It's almost a trendy term, if I may say so. But what does that really mean? And how can we be very careful of what we call evidence? I think tonight, when we look at the study and when I get a chance to interview, so to speak, the panellists, I think we need to look at the research not as evidence per se, such as we would use for a court case. It's not cross-examinable, it's not of a probative value. What we set out to do in this study was to look at trends, to look at patterns, to try and understand a little more with more depth, using, as Cedric will explain, using our archives and using our experience, a little more depth to add to our arguments of why compliance with IHL is important. So I think it's also critical that we in the humanitarian sector understand and perhaps don't put too much pressure on what do we mean by evidence-based. Sometimes we mean deep scientific studies, but in a lot of the areas we're trying to capture, it's more an art than a science. We're trying to find, as we always say, the counterfactual. We're trying to find often what didn't happen. So I think without any further ado, I might turn to our first panellist, and if I may say so, the author of this study, Cedric. And perhaps, Cedric, could you tell us a little bit about how this research was carried out? And the question I always like to ask, what were the main challenges you faced?
When we started this research on IHL and displacement, we had to face many challenges, and I will maybe start with the first one, is that at the ICRC, we were convinced that IHL is really important, but when you start a research on IHL, it's very hard not to have answers to your questions before you start. So we were, yes, of course, we were expecting to have very interesting results showing that respecting IHL is important, but it was very hard not to have this in mind while doing this research. I hope we managed to do it. And when we started, we also realized that there are plenty of articles, of research, of books about displacement in times of armed conflict. But in fact, there are very few who are really linking the factors that trigger displacement to IHL. Very often you see that displaced people say they were displaced because of violence, because of the direct or indirect effects of warfare, but then there is very few analyses trying to determine to which extent this violence or this effect are linked to IHL violations. So what we tried to do is to make this connection by having a kind of non-legal research on IHL, which means that first we tried to determine what are the factors triggering displacement in the field, and then as a posteriori analysis to determine to which extent they are linked to IHL, being respect for IHL or violations of IHL. So by adding this IHL component was a way to make an analysis that displaced people do not necessarily make when they leave. Of course, when you have your house being bombed, you are not trying to determine whether it was caused by an IHL violation or whether it is in compliance with IHL. So that's why you have to do it after the event takes place. And that's why we also decided to use ICRC archives, because as both Vincent and Helen said, the ICRC has been really active for more than 150 years. And during all our history, we have gathered plenty of data, of evidence, of histories, of personal experience of delegates that then they wrote in reports. And it is a way to use this very rich material that is obviously not used by external researchers and practitioners. And it was a way to use this very long experience to do this research, which is also a challenge because we have really thousands of reports, of internal exchanges between the HQ and the field, between delegates. We have a lot of internal analysis, but it is not always very easy to use it for a simple reason. Let's imagine that in one context, our colleagues, they gather 1,000 allegations of IHL, violations. First, we have to determine whether these acts are really violating IHL or not, which is not always easy. And then it's very hard to have a quantitative insight on this data, because we could imagine that 1 year we had difficulties to access some areas of a country, and then you have a better access, which means that we have better documentation on violations happening in this place. And this is for this reason that we decided to be more qualitative than quantitative. And I know that many of you would love to have assumptions like if you respect IHL, you will have 40% displaced people less, and it's just impossible to prove this kind of assumptions. So that's why we had really more qualitative research.
Thank you. And I think this issue about being intellectually honest and rigorous is really at the heart of any research, because I must admit, as Director of Law and Policy, it's quite scary to task my colleagues to go out and test the assumptions that are often people like myself and Dominic say in speeches. So I think the capacity to always be rigorous in saying, is what we've been articulating over many years, is there something behind it, is great. So I was very relieved when I realised that actually the research showed there was a correlation. We're going to talk a little bit with the other panellists about the consequences of displacement, but perhaps, Cedric, you could focus a little more on the role of IHL when it comes to displacement, and what are the, for example, IHL violations that are triggered with occurrences of displacement?
First, we have to recall that there are many reasons that push people to leave that might be linked to IHL, but many are not linked. There might be indirect consequences of armed conflict. And every situation is different. So even if we try to analyze one specific context, there will be personal reasons, family reasons, health reasons that will influence the decision to leave or to stay for civilian people. But what the literature already highlighted for many years is that there is a correlation between waves of violence and waves of displacement. But then the question is this violence linked to IHL? Is it a result of IHL violations, or is it something that is legal, in fact? And we know that even if you perfectly respect IHL, you will have incidental harm, you will have destruction, you might have civilians killed during military operations. And it's not that easy to determine this. But still, we tried to do it, and during the research, we could identify a set of IHL violations that trigger displacement in armed conflict. Of course, I don't have the list in my mind. I will give just an example, but you will find this list in the study. But obviously, all the violations linked to the conduct of hostilities are likely to trigger displacement. Like when you don't respect the principle of proportionality, of precaution, of distinction. We have seen that indiscriminate attacks trigger displacement, sometimes as a side effect. And we have also seen that some violations that are always obvious, like sexual violence or direct attacks against civilians, will also trigger displacement. Again, it's not always very easy to determine whether it was an IHL violations or not, but we can try to do it. I mean, ICRC, our colleagues in the field, they are very well armed to do it, and they very often analyze the situation. We also have to say that even if you perfectly respect IHL, you will have displaced people. So, of course, we don't want to pretend that respecting IHL will be the key to solve all situations of displacement. And we have also to remind that sometimes being displaced is the best solution, the best way, because when your house is bombed, you just want to flee to save your life. And then, of course, it's the best option or the least worst. And then the question will be, but for how long will you be displaced, and will it be possible to go back early or not, depending on this? But again, I can't say that IHL violations represent X% of displacement, but we can show, and it's obvious, in fact, that yes, IHL violations trigger displacement, and then they might have an impact on the patterns of displacement.
Just on those issues, could you maybe spend a minute talking to me about the issue of humanitarian access? Was there any evidence around that? Because I think the conduct of hostilities, it's pretty obvious in a way, but it's great that we now have some research behind it. But the access of humanitarians, does that have an impact?
Yes, that's a very good question, and it's very hard to answer this question because there are so many factors impacting humanitarian access and aid that come in this kind of game. For instance, we know, and the ICRC has been saying that for years, that it's very important to have very good access to people affected by armed conflict, being displaced people or people at risk of being displaced. And very often, this humanitarian assistance and protection is necessary because the authorities are not able to provide basic services to civilian populations. And we have seen that if the humanitarian assistance is very far away, it might push people to move to get access to this humanitarian aid. So it means that when you violate IHL by preventing humanitarians to do their job, or when they have, for security reasons, to withdraw, it might have an impact on displacement because then the assistance will not be provided. And of course, the protection that humanitarian actors can provide. And it's the same, in fact, for medical care, of course. We have seen, which is, again, very obvious, that if people don't have access to medical care, they might have to leave because they need, of course, this kind of service.
Thank you. Just quickly, two last questions. Can you talk a little bit about what role IHL plays in return?
First, IHL gives the right to voluntary return once the reason for being displaced ceases to exist. So it's written in IHL that displaced people have a right to return, but it doesn't mean that this is the only solution, and some will decide to resettle down in another place, and some will decide to come back after a long time. But what we have seen is that, of course, different kind of violations will have an impact on the length of displacement, and of course, the more violations are targeting individuals, families, or populations, the more it will be hard to come back because they know that they might face these violations again. But we can see also an indirect effect of respecting or violating IHL. For instance, the level of destruction. The more you will destroy a city, the more it will be hard for civilians to come back. It doesn't mean that they won't come back, and sometimes they prefer to come back even if the security is not good or even if destruction is very high. But of course, the more you destroy, the more it will be hard for displaced people to come back. One aspect that is linked to this one is the remnants of war, like landmines, unexploded ordnance, or the use of booby traps. for instance, that we have seen in many contexts, and it makes very dangerous and very hard to come back to his house. And sometimes authorities need to clean areas, which is very time-consuming, very costly, and very dangerous. And maybe the last point, which is the most important, is the question of security. Mm-hmm. If people leave one area because they might, or they are victims of IHL violations, then of course, as long as they might face these dangers, they don't want to come back, even if they would like to. Which means that although you will have preventive displacement, I should have mentioned it before, but again, the patterns are very, very complicated, and what I'm saying tonight is high simplification of what you will find in the study, of course.
The final question before I move on is, and this is a hard one, could you just briefly synthesize the main findings?
Okay.
In sound bites so I can tweet them. No, okay. Not really. No. I think this is the essence, if I may say, ladies and gentlemen, of actually doing research, is it's really hard without all the footnotes and the preambular sense of, but we can't promise it all the time. We're living in a world where it is hard to actually spend time to write a deep document, and it's much easier to tweet something out. So could you do me the tweetable version?
Well, I will have a very simple answer. Is IHL matters. If you respect or if you violate IHL, there will be a huge difference in the field. It might look a bit easy to say it in Geneva, which is a very peaceful city, and then we will have a nice cocktail. But in fact, for the millions of people affected by armed conflict, respecting or violating IHL will have a huge difference on their lives. They might even be killed by this. So this is my key message. In fact, IHL matters. It's very important to respect it, and it has an impact on displacement. It has an impact on people at risk of being displaced. It has a protective power when respected on displaced people, and it contributes to return. So it means that if we want to address the question of displacement, of its consequences, and on the way to protect all different categories of civilians, it is very important to put IHL in the reflection, which is not always done. And this is just a plea for integrating IHL when it comes to displacement and for better respect, which is a very simple conclusion, I hope.
Well done. Years of work, and you can get it down to one line. Impressive. Well, look, thank you, Cedric. And as I said, I think there'll be opportunities at that cocktail and other times too, I think, to be able to engage with a bit more depth of the research you've been looking at. But thank you for that. I'll move across to Bina. Now, Bina is the head of Department for Policy and Research at IDMC. And we're really delighted to have you come along tonight, because I think you're thinking in a similar way to what we are reflecting on, which is how we can put extra pressure and have extra compelling arguments of the things that we care about. So my first question to you relates to a study that you've recently, or a topic of a report you've recently published called Unveiling the Costs of Internal Displacement. Why are you as an institution and as a policy and researcher interested in highlighting the costs and the consequences of displacement?
Before I talk about our own study, I really want to congratulate Cedric and the team on this work, because it is really an important study, but what impressed me most was the pragmatism and the ambition that's reflected in the study. And as Vincent was rightly saying, it's a stepping stone, I think, for a lot more. It's really impressive, I think, the pragmatism in it, because it doesn't just try to unveil and really analyze in depth the different ways in which IHL violations might trigger more or less displacement, but it also does that in a way that tries to actually create and show incentives to actually reduce IHL violations. And it explicitly says what we need to do is add to our legal and humanitarian arguments also the argument of impact in terms of also economic impact. So that's where our study and our work comes in, because at IDMC, we've been monitoring internal displacement, particularly in the context of conflict, but also disasters now for more than 20 years. And in doing so, have really realized that despite some progress at the policy level and despite frameworks existing and some legal attempts or progress in terms of developing legal frameworks, actual progress on the ground is very slow. And what we've tried to therefore, or the conclusion that we've come to is a similar one that we've come to in the study. What we need is a different set of evidence and different set of conclusions and insights than we've had to date. So lasting solutions to displacement, but also lasting solutions to IHL violations will have to be ultimately political solutions. And what this report, I think, really nicely shows is that regardless of whether it's in relation to prevention or to protection of those displaced, also in fact returns, IHL violations will have a great role to play. So congratulations on that. So when I talk about incentives and the positive aspects of the study that we see, I think it's particularly the economic incentives that we've identified as an area that probably need more articulation. And we were just talking, Dominic and I, beforehand, this is probably not the right set of incentives or a right argument to make within active conflict or while human rights violations and IHL violations are underway. But in the context of prevention, in the context of reconstruction, it's very much a perspective that we feel can actually change the narrative. And we've started doing this in our own field, research work that we've actually really identified as one of the priority areas of our work now in two ways. One was to, similarly to the study that you've done, is to understand the multiple ways in which displacement impacts on the different dimensions of an economy, of a society, be it through education, impacts on education, health, security, but also housing and infrastructure. And the impacts that it actually has on the IDPs themselves, on host communities, but also wider societies and economies. So interestingly, of course, the report, I think, and what, again, commendable, shows the devastating impacts displacement has on health of individuals, but also on systems, but particularly also highlights the impacts on mental health and psychosocial well-being, which is something that's often overlooked. And the 7 dimensions that we have identified in our research correspond very much to what is being highlighted here. And in addition, we look at impacts on environment, impacts on social life indeed as well, and on the political landscape, because ultimately that will have an impact on future stability. And I think what, so that was kind of the first step to really understand the multidimensionality of impacts of displacement. And therefore, ultimately, based on the case you're making, the multidimensionality of impacts of IHL violations. And very often when we look at existing research, but also programs based on the evidence that we currently have, it's just 1 or 2 dimensions that we're addressing. It's not usually the whole sweep. And then the second step in the work that we've embarked on was really to say, if we're talking about economic impacts, we'll have to at some point quantify them. So it's coming. So, but how do we do that? We also have to be, as you rightly say, very honest in what we can quantify and what we cannot, and what we should try and quantify and what we should not. But what we did try to do is actually cost out the direct impact, so the direct costs of displacement in terms of providing shelter, providing education, etc. And that's a very conservative, of course, estimate of the monetary costs of the economic impacts, but that in itself already shows significant, really staggering numbers. So for example, in the context of the Central African Republic, between 2013 and 2017, the conflict-related displacement resulted in an economic impact or monetary cost of the equivalent of 11.3% of pre-crisis GDP. So we have the same also happening in the context of drought. In Somalia, we've seen in 1 year alone in 2017, the equivalent of 4.7% of pre-crisis GDP that we could estimate the cost to be associated with displacement. So that's kind of, if we compare it to GDP, that's a questionable parameter maybe, but interestingly also if you compare the economic impact only that direct cost of displacement to the overall cost that's estimated, for example, the types of estimates that are out there about the total cost of violence and conflict in a country. In the Central African Republic, this estimate was made and the displacement costs alone were 54% of the total cost of violence. In Somalia, displacement, and this only internal displacement in the country, the costs that we estimate were the equivalent of 48% of the total asset losses estimated and the total economic losses associated with the drought. So it means that in a crisis setting where displacement occurs, it's actually a major part of the financial burden on the state, on humanitarian actors, on the economy. And that's, we believe, an argument that needs to be added, as I said, to the existing legal, moral, and humanitarian arguments.
Thank you. I think this idea that we all need to be more multifaceted, more holistic in our analysis is a really important one, and it certainly is the experience we have as an institution. So we've got your piece of research. We've got the research now on IHL and displacement. What areas do you think going forward needs to be still explored? What do you think the future holds for us? What do we need to start thinking about next?
Because I started off with the need for creating evidence for incentives now. One thing is the economic argument, but if you think from a country's or also political perspective, of course, stability is the other big area. It's kind of what does it mean for future, if we lose a generation, for future societies, for the political environment, and the ability for a nation and a region to actually remain or become stable. So that's kind of one thing where I believe we don't yet have the right, we are starting to develop the right tools, but we don't have the full assessments yet that could be done. And again, the link to IHL violations would be extremely interesting to look at in that regard. And then another area I think is really to look at, in that whole context of stability, the impact of experience of IHL violations and displacement in the context of those, what that has on then the ability of those displaced to engage in political life. And there are studies now on voting behavior that changes after having been displaced. There are studies on the radical shift that can occur in terms of the societal kind of cohesion and just a mindset and the social fabric of a community, and that's kind of where I think more work needs to be done. What would be excellent also finally maybe is just to work together on scenarios, because as we have to be honest that we can't correlate or where correlation can exist, we can't create causalities just out of nothing, and we can't always quantify those relationships, but we can see based on qualitative analysis and evidence, we can develop scenarios. We can say if this amount of displacement is going to occur, you can expect a certain it playing out in this way or in that way, and you can develop, like in the climate science, you can develop different scenarios that will allow actually to identify different policy entry points.
I'll now move across to Dominic Steelhart. I'm really delighted to sit here with Dominic. We are both colleagues, and it's really nice. I know how busy Dominic is, so I thank you for joining us. And I think it also demonstrates that from the ICRC's perspective, the compliance with IHL is not just something that sits in the Department of the Law and Policy, but is also of deep concern and resonance with our colleagues who run the operations. So thank you, Dominic, for being here tonight. I think the first question really is on the thematic topic. Why is ICRC, for example, interested in the issue of displacement? Why is it a topic that we care about?
I think there is a very simple and obvious reason why we are interested in internal displacement. It is one of the most obvious consequences of conflict. We have now nearly 70 million people that have been uprooted by conflict, 2/3 of which are internally displaced people who have never crossed an international border. And these are obviously part of the people affected by conflict that we are serving. And we have a lot of first-hand accounts of the terrible suffering that is inflicted by displacement. I have myself in my career probably spoken to thousands of internally displaced, lately in Libya or in Venezuela, although this is now not typically a conflict situation. And you just see the incredible suffering that is generated by displacement, and not just material needs, but also, of course, psychological needs. And it is therefore no surprise that we are spending a large part of our own budget and our efforts on trying to prevent displacement, on assisting people who are displaced, but also host communities that are extremely important. As we speak, two of our most important operations in favor of displaced people are definitely in the northeast of Syria, where we have about 80,000 people that came out of these last pockets that were controlled by the Islamic State group. And Vincent, you mentioned in your introduction the issue of dehumanizing certain categories in order very often to lower the bar for respect of international humanitarian law. And these are typically people where a lot of, even in the international community, a lot of states would actually like to lower the bar for respect of international humanitarian law. And we are dealing precisely with this population. And we are also dealing with the more or less 50,000 people that were displaced by recent conflict in Libya, in Tripoli.
So we have humans behind the numbers, we have genuine suffering, and we have institutions like the ICRC spending a significant amount of our budget on this issue. So I think I can see clearly it's something that is of great concern to the ICRC. And whilst we as an institution focus much more on the consequences of displacement, that's our job, why do you think, Dominic, it's important for us to at least reflect or encourage a reflection on the causes of displacement?
As we are not just a relief organization, we need to understand the drivers of displacement. And Cedric, you mentioned in the summary of the study that there are different reasons for displacement. You have displacement, for instance, for reasons of people not having access to vital infrastructure, as we see now in many contexts in the Middle East. And here, a type of response that often has an effect is supporting the health systems, supporting water and sanitation systems in order to give people a choice to either stay or to leave. If we are, however, dealing with indiscriminate or disproportionate attacks against civilian populations, mainly in urban areas, we may engage with the parties to the conflict on what we call a conduct of hostility dialogue or a protection dialogue, as we do, for instance, very intensely now in Yemen. The most difficult, I always find, the most difficult situations are definitely situations in which parties to the conflict deliberately attack civilians to displace them. We've been dealing with these type of situations in many contexts, but South Sudan being a case in point, and Myanmar, Rakhine, definitely another one. And there, very often, the only thing that you can do is assist the people who have been displaced, as conduct of hostility dialogue has certain limits.
Yes, and I think as an institution with our dual mandate through the assistance and protection, I think it's pretty clear to say today that often protection is very challenging, particularly when we, as you said, witness parties to a conflict that it's not accidental, it's a specific aim in relation to these matters. So thank you, Dominic. It's really good to hear from the field some of the experiences. Just from your point of view, what do you think parties to an armed conflict can do more to respect IHL?
Well, I think the study demonstrated or illustrated very clearly that violations of international humanitarian law are very often the cause of displacement, and the easy answer, Helen, is to say parties need to respect international humanitarian law to prevent displacement, to allow assistance and protection for people who are displaced, but then also when it comes to safe and dignified return. And whilst we see bits and pieces in almost every context of parties doing either one or the other, very often we don't see the entire package. And I think this is where we need to find new ways and different ways of convincing parties, including like those arguments that, Bina, you mentioned on the economic cost, to convince them to perhaps better respect international humanitarian law.
And then my final question, Dominic, is just from your perspective, how do you think we as the ICRC or the wider humanitarian community can convince parties to a conflict to better respect IHL? We mentioned before we need to find new methods, more new research, but any other ideas you might have?
Well, honestly, Helen, I was actually afraid that you were going to ask me that question.
Oh, excellent. Well,
and it's actually a question that I've been asking myself for a very long time, because I remember in my first mission as an ICRC delegate, we go through these integration courses, and we are taught how to disseminate international humanitarian law, as we called it at that time. And I remember I was very proud in Somalia. There was a group of about 30, 40 fighters, and I took out the flip chart that we were given, and I gave them a session on how to respect international humanitarian law, and I just realized actually either I'm doing a very poor job here, or the material I was given in Geneva is very bad, or maybe both, but they were definitely more interested in the food that we served than in my session on international humanitarian law. So things have fortunately evolved, and we have started to use cultural references, comparing IHL with Quran, with other cultural references. And I think more recently there were perhaps one or two interesting initiatives. One is again in the Middle East, where we have nearly 30 states that are either directly or indirectly involved in the different conflicts in the Middle East, supporting either other states or non-state armed groups. And it is clear that those states that are supporting non-state armed groups or other states, they have opportunities to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. They have to respect themselves, but they have also opportunities to ensure respect of international humanitarian laws by the parties they are supporting. And we have developed interesting discussions and dialogue with all these 30 states. What is potential good practice if you want to ensure respect for international humanitarian law, in terms of adequate training, in terms of including IHL in rules of engagement, in terms of appropriate use of weapons, investigate allegation of IHL violations, and if proved true, of course, also prosecute those that are committing these violations. So that, I think, is an interesting new way of trying to adapt also to modern ways of conducting warfare, as we see it now very often in the Middle East. And another study that I find interesting is that Roots of Restraint study, that basically demonstrates that power doesn't only lie in formal structures, that we have to much more work with informal structures, with peer-to-peer engagement, with influencers of fighters of non-state armed groups, be it Islamic, religious scholars, very often, of course, in these contexts in which we are operating, Islamic scholars. These are all interesting, I would say, new approaches. And then last but not least, very often we just have to be extremely pragmatic. Instead of preaching international humanitarian law, trying to find what is the interest of parties to actually better respect international humanitarian law. And one example that comes to mind, which is not directly related to IDPs, is in places of detention, health issues, TB, tuberculosis, for instance, they are often not contained in places of detention if they are not being brought under control. So there is definitely an interest of these parties to let an organization such as the ICRC visit and intervene in order to get such a disease under control.
This idea that we have to hold on strongly to the normative values that have been created and to the law itself, but find ways where, when you were a young delegate, could have made them stay for not just the food. So thank you for both the clarity, but also the reflections on how we can push, I think, in a more articulate and a more persuasive way to ensure respect for IHL. So thank you very much. I'll now come to our final speaker, Joaquin, is that how I pronounce it? Joaquin, beautiful name. Really delighted to have you here. Your role is the head of the humanitarian migration section of the EU delegation to the UN and other international organisations in Geneva. So certainly a lot to say on this topic. But perhaps I'll start by asking you a bit of reflection. We know that displacement is a global challenge. We also know that IHL is universal. But interestingly, with IHL, obviously its implementation is done at a national level by states. What role do you see the EU in ensuring that IHL is respected?
Thank you, Helen, for inviting us to be part of this panel, and congratulations on Cedric for a very reader-accessible and friendly study, which was very interesting to read. And I wouldn't say there is anything that you intuitively wouldn't know, but it's good to get the backing through your research to basically confirm some of the things, assumptions or let's say assessments that we have ourselves. Now on the role of the EU, it's a big question, Helen, because the EU, of course, is a supranational organization. We're not a state, we're not a ratifying party to the Geneva Conventions, but we do a lot on IHL. First of all, of course, the European Union and European Community in its first instance is the creation of a political commitment and will of our founding fathers that there shouldn't be any war anymore in Europe after World War II. So in a way, we're the creation of a strong political commitment that we are going to basically bring together European states with basically, I would say, the ambition to ensure stability, security, but also prosperity in Europe. And based on that, let's say, instinct, or on that strong basis, the European Union has become a strong promoter, but also strong, making strong commitments to the promotion of IHL international law and basically preserving human dignity. Now, we have a quite complex structure, and I would briefly mention that as EU, our legal base to act on international law and IHL goes back to the Lisbon Treaty. And the Lisbon Treaty is basically the treaty of 2004 that basically explains the functioning of the European Union. And therein it's very clear that we are to promote human rights, democracy, and respect for international law. Now, customary international law, including IHL, also applies to the EU. And it's in that capacity that we also basically pursue the respect for IHL by third parties, state, non-state armed groups. And we have, I would say, a certain toolbox that facilitates our work in that. First of all, the EU is, I would say, a labyrinth of different institutions and functions. You have the European Commission that can provide funding. You have the Council of Member States that can take political decisions. You have the High Representative on Foreign Security Policy, who can, together with the External Action Service, issue statements, undertake démarches. So we have a toolbox to basically pursue respect for IHL, as you mentioned, which in the end needs national implementation. Now, we're also an important humanitarian actor. And also in our humanitarian, let's say, basic legal documents, it's very clear that also as a humanitarian actor, we have to act in compliance with IHL and with the fundamental principles, humanitarian principles of impartiality, neutrality, independence, humanity. This has also been, I would say, mirrored in some of key policy documents that are the basis to then undertake actions. For instance, the global strategy, the EU's global strategy on foreign and security policy clearly gives us the toolbox for reaching out on respect and promotion of IHL. And to give you some examples, for instance, when we have EU military missions that are prepared for, and I myself have dealt with civil-military coordination for quite some time, our EU military staff, in designing the operation, they need to also comply with IHL. And so what, for instance, we as the humanitarian leg of the European Union would do is to reach out to them and engage. And for instance, I remember it was in, I think, 2007, 2008, our EU military staff were preparing for an intervention in Africa. And so I go there with my colleague and they say, Kim, we have good news. We are not going to do humanitarian aid. And I say, that's fantastic, but what are you going to do? And they said, we're going to do water and sanitation. And I said, okay, we really need to discuss, because they wanted to basically provide water within the compliance of the sphere standards. But while it was in a very drought-affected area of Africa, that was not exactly what humanitarian actors were doing. So there was an agreement basically of what, let's say, was feasible in terms of providing water to the affected population. So we said, if you do that, you're going to create a pull factor. You're going to create displacement towards your water provision. So just to show also what Cedric in his study put forward is that sometimes there are unintentional effects creating displacement while some people try, or actors try to do the right thing. And that's where I think also humanitarian actors have to come in and basically, how would I say, promote and advocate on what is actually the right thing to do. We also do a lot of what I would call more smart diplomacy that is not through Twitter or Facebook, but for instance, if I look at the conflict in Syria, the EU as such undertakes a lot of diplomacy towards the Syrian opposition. We've done so also towards the Syrian government, not directly, but this happens often through intermediaries. We also, on the humanitarian side, try to basically establish a good dialogue and liaison with our Turkish colleagues, with our Russian colleagues, on, for instance, deconfliction in Idlib. And this is fundamental if we know that 3 million civilians are in Idlib and would be severely affected by any military operation that takes place. So there's a lot that we undertake, also often together with our EU member states, in a way of a more coordinated fashion, through coordinated statements, public statements that are being made. So yes, we have a bit of a toolbox, and of course there's the financing. The financing to, for instance, ICRC and other actors on dissemination of IHL, on the training of state, non-state actors on IHL. For instance, on healthcare in danger, we were also a strong supporter because we do feel that attacks on medical missions, especially medical workers, hospitals, infrastructure, ambulances, and I think this comes out from the study of Cedric, have such a devastating effect on the affected population. I mean, it's not only a human cost in a way, when the personnel is physically attacked and sometimes you lose personnel, of course, but it's also having a huge demoralizing effect on the affected population. Aside also the fact that, of course, a lot of basic services then cannot be provided anymore, and it triggers displacement. And this type of displacement often can occur for a longer term, so it becomes more protracted, because the more brutal that the violence or the impact is, as Cedric's study shows, the longer that the displacement can last.
In that context, how do you think this study could be used, particularly going forward to, as we hope it will do, promote better respect for IHL?
The size of displacement is so big now. I mean, we're talking about 68.5 million people displaced, mainly due to conflict. I mean, for 80% of the humanitarian operations where the EU engages as a donor, it's conflict. It's not natural disasters. They also do basically result often in displacement, but it's mainly violence and conflict. So I think what the study brings to bear is compelling evidence, if you want, but in a scientific, non-scientific, I would say, very accessible way, that indeed the non-respect of IHL does trigger certain forms of displacement that are forced, even though, and I liked the wording that people who decide to move are not necessarily victims, but in a way they are decision makers and actors and agents. At the same time, quite often, people don't have many choices of what to do in a let's say, hot burning conflict. So I think in that way, the study can help to sensitize, to raise the awareness that, yes, you know, non-compliance to IHL does have huge effects. And I think aside the economic and aside the social impact, the human impact is something that I think we will never be able to quantify. If you ask a displaced person how this displacement has impacted her or his life, and often it's multiple displacements or it's a protracted displacement, I think there is no cost or no quantification that you can bring to it. It's very disruptive to people. It reminds me of a Syrian doctor who basically migrated to Europe and who basically said, it's as if you have to restart basically your life. You have to learn everything again in a new society. And I think not having been uprooted ourselves, luckily, it's very difficult to fully understand what that actually does to a human's life. So as Dominique also said, it's a moral obligation, but it's also, I think, no action is not an option. We have to address some of these root causes and drivers of such forms of displacement. And in conflict, definitely for us, IHL is the best way, not maybe to prevent all kind of displacement, but definitely to mitigate the impact of displacement and maybe some forms of displacement as well.
Well, I think we've heard from all the panelists, and what I wanted to do was open it up to you, the audience. I know there's diplomats here, there's academics here, there's members of humanitarian organisations, there's students. Not only some questions for the panelists, but also any ideas, any engagement you want to have. We've got about 20 minutes, so I would ask you to be rather succinct. But I think it is an important opportunity. As I said at the start, we are exploring this. This is, I would say, the first time we launch something. We're learning as we go along, but we feel we really need to take the consequences of armed conflict away from just the battlefield and be more widely engaged in this.
I'm the deputy head of the Austrian delegation here in Geneva, and I would like to focus a little bit on the crux of the matter here is why IHL matters in war and conflict. It seems that we are living in a bit of a cynical world concerning multilateralism, but also the respect and the further development of international humanitarian law. This seems to be stalled currently. In the very beginning, there was mention of an IHL database that tries to focus on a positive narrative, and Dominik Stillhardt was also already kind of starting based on his vast experience from the field. I mean, what might work, maybe not a preacher-style approach of IHL, but more a pragmatic, bear in mind tribal, cultural, religious backgrounds and try to form a new package around that. But I think we should go a little bit further. What kind of positive narrative is out there? I mean, is that something we can qualify or quantify? I think that is very important to maybe help us a little bit to move forward also with the possibility of restarting IHL further development. If we can first make the case, well, there have been examples where it works, and it might be possible to, qualify that at least a little bit to overcome this vast cynicism that is out there. Thank you.
I'm a student from Lyon, and I'm working now for child protection in an NGO. I want to ask, do you think it will be one day possible to create and adopt internationally a legal document such as a refugee convention to protect IDPs?
Well, I might take these two questions. The first one really an exploration about how we need to go even further on finding new ways and perhaps the positive narrative. As Vincent expressed our database on how we can change the narrative. And then the second one about child protection, a very specific question about, I would say, the framework, potential normative framework around IDPs, which is almost a seminar in and of itself, but I'd be keen to hear what members of the panel, if they did have views on, would like to say. But perhaps I'll start with you, Cedric, in relation to this idea around the positive narrative and how to look more pragmatically.
Yes. First, I have to say that this question should be asked to my colleague Juliane, who is leading the IHL in Action platform, especially as she is working on patterns of respect on what is contributing to respect for IHL. So there will be more to come in the next months about this. But we could also say that the IHL Impact research series has this aim at some point, because, of course, it's very hard to make counterfactual research, as Helen mentioned at the beginning of this panel. And that's why I had to really focus on IHL violations rather than respect for IHL. But I hope that with the time we will be able to show and maybe to compare different situations, in one with many IHL violations and in other with more respect. But yes, of course, even if we focus on violations, we can say, okay, here is what happens. So maybe if you don't commit this kind of violations, you might have less consequences, which is not totally positive, but it's a first way to show the interest of respecting IHL. And then we should have maybe have more highlighted the fact that IHL protects people, and this is a way that we will continue to highlight in the next IHL Impact Research question. But yes, really, this is really the beginning of a research series, and I hope that at some point both IHL Impact and IHL in Action will have a common narrative showing that there are many examples of respect, and if you respect, you will have a positive impact. And for the next research, that's what we would like to do, to show the long-term benefits of respecting IHL, and it's not that easy to document, but in fact, one of the problems is that parties to a conflict, they have sometimes short-term aims in mind, and they might have a strategic advantage if they have a very violent operation, I don't know, but they don't necessarily have in mind the long-term consequences of both of violations or of respect. And maybe we should try to highlight it more, even though it's very hard to convince parties to conflict to think maybe on the mid or long term, like, look, you might get benefits at the end of the conflict, but this is a way that we want to explore. And I hope we will have more to propose you in the coming months and years.
Thank you. And I really like, we tend to spend our time looking at patterns of disrespect. So to start looking at patterns of respect might be another way. Just perhaps any comments you might have, Bina?
Maybe just to add to what Cedric was saying, I absolutely think that while we were talking, or I was talking a lot about the impact, negative impacts and the cost estimates that we feel are important to put on the table, that's really to, in a sense, make visible the hidden costs, which are on nobody's balance sheet at the moment. And I think if we can look at both the cost, but then also the opportunities, if we were to reduce the negative impacts, then that's something that we can look at it more broadly, not just in terms of just the parties to a conflict, but those that are also, as we see increasingly in conflicts happening at the moment as well, those who are involved but by remote. So, and those who are involved in humanitarian action in those contexts as well, so that we actually are able to not just, I think the returns part and the way that you frame it in the report is very good, where you actually look at the impacts that IHL violations may have on major destructions, which mean long-term protracted displacement because people are not able to return. Similarly, as you were saying, Joachim, about the actual impact it has on social identity, on psychological and mental health, and people not being able to actually recover from this type of impact and this type of experience. It means that those who are engaged in the conflict, but also supporting conflict from behind the scenes, but also very actively, are actually not taking into account those costs in those territories that they are purportedly trying to actually claim. So if we were to be able to actually, as you were saying, start having longer-term studies, but particularly of those contexts where we can see, over the last conflicts, be it, for example, in Mosul now, where we can see reconstruction already, or the plans for reconstruction and the amounts that are being estimated that it will take to reconstruct the city are massive. If we were to be able to look at that over a longer period of time, but also in comparison to other cities and other contexts, that could start building that case, hopefully.
Well, I would like to have an answer to the question that we heard from our Austrian colleague. What is the new package? What is the future package? And it links also to the second question, which I understand, is there a possibility to have an IDP compact, like we have a refugee and a migration compact respectively? And just to tell you that we tried hard to bring IDPs into these compacts, but for exactly the same reasons, that today the international environment is not very conducive to developing international humanitarian law, as you have experienced, and you can tell loads of stories, Helen, about the compliance initiative that we tried to drive with the states. At this point in time, I think the big progress or big new packages are kind of elusive. So that is also why we are looking for more pragmatic solutions on the ground, trying to convince warring parties to respect IHL because it is in their interest. I think that is the kind of approach that we are now taking. And I have to say, although it is difficult to quantify, but we see it. We see it every day, how treatment of prisoners that we are visiting in many places is improving. The conduct of hostility is changing, although the issue there, or the question there, is always what is the contribution that a conduct of hostility dialogue makes to a change, to a party changing their tactics? Is it the dialogue that our delegates have with South Sudanese commanders not to attack the hospitals and health centers, or is it out of other interests they have or other influence they are under that things are changing? But I think there is more we can do in the realm of trying to find common interests where it is possible to find these common interests. But again, I said, if IHL violations are part of a deliberate tactic of war, that really becomes difficult. Here, obviously, the international community, humanitarian diplomacy, diplomatic efforts are required to put a stop to these type of situations. And again, we have what we have with regards to the international community today.
Yeah, I would very much agree also with what Dominique says. I think it's, from my experience or what I've been able to observe, there's IHL and there's, we say respect for IHL, and here in Geneva many of us very well understand what it means, and then it's applied to a context. And then in a context you realize actually that local actors or even national actors have little to no, maybe in-depth knowledge of what that IHL actually means to their context. And it's in a way sensitizing, but also raising awareness and actually pointing to some responsibilities. Sometimes that works, and it's what Dominique says, it's maybe a combination of different elements. It's the ICRC delegates, it's donor countries, or it's diplomatic missions. Is it always successful? Yes and no. I mean, I think there are clearly examples where I can see if we wouldn't have done this, and I can give an example, for instance, Rukban in Syria, I don't think that we would have seen humanitarian convoys to Rukban, but it took months of discussions in the Syria Humanitarian Task Force. And, in a way, smart pressuring, but also, showing the human suffering, the human cost of the situation there. In a way, the undignified situation, many children there. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And then it's the willingness of those actors that have the influence, who have the power or the control to actually act and do the right thing. But personally, I think it's always worth the effort, because the non-action, I think, is too easy and will lead to nothing. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I think we always feel in our DNA as the ICRC, the status quo is never good enough, and we have to constantly keep looking at ways to do what I think is that very essential element of whether it be working with others in a different way, whether it be to using research, whether it be to using new digital ways, but different ways to this very basic idea of ensuring respect for IHL.
Good evening. My name is Joshua Neo from the Geneva Academy. My question is to Mr. Cedric Cotter. I needed you to kindly explain how exactly you defined displacement with regard to, and how exactly that had an impact on your assessment of the protective value of IHL. I say that because I'm thinking about a number of ways that displacement could be translated. We have instances where displacement can take place over probably hours, days. We know of situations where displacement takes place over days and nights, depending on the impact of violence, between both towns and countryside areas. So, and that I think also raises, critical questions in terms of protection of IHL, where people find themselves sometimes in more of harm's way in those situations. So how exactly did you define displacement more broadly, and how did that have an impact on your assessment of the protective value of IHL?
Volulé from SDC. First of all, thank you very much for this very exciting exploration of on changing narratives. I also appreciated this small reminder that sometimes maybe displacement may also be a protective protection strategy. And I think at this moment, in these times, it is maybe good also to remind that migration and movements are not only crimes or criminal behaviors from people, and I think that it is important that to consider that it can be a positive coping mechanism from civilians to move. Maybe it's really an open question, but when hearing what you were saying on the economic cost of displacement, I was wondering, thinking about Iraq or Syria, what is the benefit of some rulers to divide the society? And I'm wondering if the currency that we are looking at, economic costs, yeah, that's an option. But maybe also reminding my old courses in sociology, wondering if another currency could be the question of power. And when we look at, again, Iraq, for instance, we can see that some leaders gain something at dividing a national society, gain in power. Discrimination of part of the population, but the benefit is not in GDP or in dollars, but in power. And I'm wondering if this currency, to analyze this currency, could lead us to somewhere else in terms of exploration.
So I'll start with you, Cedric.
Yeah, just to say that we have a glossary at the beginning of the study, so we give a definition. And just one very important point is that IHL is talking about forced displacement, but it has a specific meaning. And what we wanted to say by displacement is people that are forced to leave, but we didn't use the expression forced displacement because it has a specific meaning in IHL, so that's why. And maybe just to sum up, I will have a very simple final word. When I was doing this research, I realized that IHL has very broad consequences. Of course, you have the consequences of violations, but you have the consequences of respect. IHL is not designed to address the question of displacement only. This is not the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees. This is really a very broad body of law. But we can see that if you respect or if you violate some specific provisions that are linked to the protection of healthcare, or linked to the conduct of hostilities, linked to the protection of civilians, you will have side effects that will have an impact on many phenomena that are health, that are displacement in this case. And so that's my main takeaway, that yes, IHL is, when respected, of course, IHL is really powerful in addressing many or most of the consequences of armed conflict.
I'm glad that you asked the question, because it's actually also with Swiss support that we're embarked on the second phase of our economic impacts research. So it's great to hear you also mentioning, though, the other currency, and I completely agree with you. But I think, therefore, it links back to what Dominique was talking about in terms of trying to pragmatically look at what's in the interest of parties. Because ultimately, once we understand the interest, but we can then also make, hopefully, a much more compelling argument to show what the trade-offs are. Because if your interest is to actually stay in power, but then power over what type of scenario? So if we think about the unintended or also intended consequences, what broader than displacement that IHL violations will have in a city, over a territory, over a society, then that means that actually ultimately the cost that you're paying for it, and not in economic terms, but in terms of taking power as the currency and then actually generating displacement through IHL violations, will be actually too high. If we can make that more visible, if we can make that clear, that there's, frame it in the context of risk and of trade-offs, of managing those trade-offs, and actually saying, well, you may want to now see this as a short-term strategy, but in the long term, you're going to pay double, triple, etc., then hopefully that would start also making the case.
I think it is really an important question that you asked about this currency of power. And I'd say, whilst we as an organization probably understand political power very well in situations of armed conflict, because that is also a survival. You just need to understand power relationships between parties to the conflict. We, and this also came out of a study that we did in terms of our capacity to integrate people affected by conflict systematically in our response, and how inclusive we are of people affected by conflict. We realized that we have more difficulties to understand how conflict impacts power relationships within a community, and how it drives also exclusion, and therefore how we can better adapt our response if we understand better how conflict impacts on power relationships. And I think that is, I'm interested in this question, and it is one that we definitely are pursuing, because we believe also it will help us to strengthen our response. And my kind of final word here is also one to our own organization. Somebody said this evening how difficult it is to influence behavior and behaviors. And we have this dual mandate, assisting people, but also is also this protection mandate, which is all about influencing behaviors. And I always say also to our new staff in the organization, it is much easier to bring food parcels across front lines, as difficult as it may be, as the Syria example has shown for too long time. But it is much easier compared to our mandate of influencing behaviors. And I want you to spend, and I want us and all of us to spend more time and energy on finding, I like your idea, what is the new package that will help us to effectively influence behaviors of warring parties, because that is what eventually will respond to what people affected by conflict are telling us everywhere. They do not want first and foremost food parcels. They want to be protected from violence. And for this we need to find new ways of influencing behaviors.
To the Swiss colleague, I would maybe reply back with a question. Isn't in most of the conflicts the issue about power relations that are shifting or that need to be reorganized, so to say, by the parties that are taking part in the conflict? And then I think one of the elements that you mentioned is, of course, where I was thinking of, the whole war economy that strives basically around conflict. And I think, for instance, the north of the Kivu is for me a very typical example where, in a way, access to natural resources have basically created, to some people's or some parties' interest, a whole wave of displacement, instability. It's also happening, of course, to border areas, so that's always a bit fungy. But I think what you also mentioned is very right, that if you look at certain countries where power relations have shifted, it also has had an impact basically on the nation building in a way, and the composition of the nation. And it's not a secret that also with regard to Syria and discussions on, return, big questions are about the safety and the security of those people who would return. Who is allowed to return? Are these only people of a certain, let's say, conviction or religion? Or is it all Syrians that were displaced that are able to return, both the internal displaced and the refugees? So these kind of challenges are definitely going to come closer and closer to us, definitely. And there, I think the respect, and that shows the study as well, respect for IHL, also with regard to returns, to make it dignified and sustainable, will be fundamental. And so there's yet another advocacy role that has to be played by different actors.
Thank you very much. And I know one of the really interesting outcomes that we hadn't thought about before we started was this issue about returns.
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, our time is up. I wanted to sincerely thank the panellists. As I said, I think we've had rich discussions and debates about these issues. I think we've obviously come up with a lot of questions, but I think looking at these issues in a more methodological way through research is certainly, I would say, one element of this new package that we need to build together. So please join me in thanking the guests we've had tonight. Thank you very much.